Hit record there. Okay, we got one attendee, 3, 4. I think Ron has joined as a guest there. Offer. You're on mute. Good morning and welcome to everybody joining. We have 10 now, and we'll be starting shortly. Give it another minute or two. Welcome everyone joining. We'll get underway in a couple of minutes. We'll just make some final adjustments. Morning to those just joining, entering the room. You can see us, but we can't see you, but you're very welcome. Still have a few joining now. Now, we're up to 14 now. I think we'll get underway in about a minute now.
Yeah, Colin, what you can do, if you go to the attendees, you click Ron's.
Oh yeah, allowed to talk, yeah.
Right.
We'll get Ron. Welcome, Ron.
Ron, can you hear us?
Hello?
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Ron. Good morning.
Can you open the video?
1 minute. I don't have a possibility to open the video.
Okay, do you have the link that Alona has?
Here, join as a panelist.
No, I just enabled you to join as a panelist there. We have 15 people in the room here. So I think we'll...
Here.
Hi, Ron. Good morning.
Right.
So I think, Colin, we're good to go.
Yeah, okay, we're good to go. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining this quite unique webinar. It's the first one we've done regarding healthcare, and I'm sure it'll be very informative. I'm just going to share my screen and run through 1 or 2 slides here for you. So you should be able to see this. So I'm just going to leave my details there. For those of you who don't know me, Colin Sheena is my name. I'm working at the Israeli Embassy here in Dublin for the Economy Ministry in Israel and also with the Foreign Ministry. So if you want to take a screenshot or capture those details, you're very welcome, and you can reach out to me at a later stage. I just want to welcome our speakers and introduce them this morning. So myself and Offer are representing the Ministry of Economy's Foreign Trade Administration. Most of you are probably familiar with us. Our job is to try and help the Israeli exporting community. Our partners today are the Israel Export Institute, again, probably familiar to all those joining us. And we're very pleased to have Ron Pando here, who's with the Health Tech Division. And I'm exceptionally happy to welcome our 2 Irish partners today. First is Ken Waters from Hume Brophy. Hume Brophy is an international communications firm specializing in public affairs, public and investor relations, corporate and financial communications. And Ken works in the healthcare, energy, pharma, and technology sectors. Previously, he's got experience with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canada, so he's very well acquainted with the interface between public and private sector. Also joining us is Tony Corrigan from Orbital. Tony's the CEO, and their speciality is providing bid management software, which helps companies get involved and win tender processes. Tony has a wealth of experience in software development, enterprise sales, IT management, and most importantly, perhaps for this session, procurement consultancy. So just to give you 1 or 2 minutes overview, as I said, I'm working with the Foreign Trade Administration, and chiefly our role is to assist Israeli companies with the export of goods and services to the countries we are serving in, and also to engage in a variety of other trade activity, investment, you know, the whole gambit. Just a little bit about Ireland and Israel in terms of trade relations. So both are able to take advantage of the EU preferential trade agreement. There are a couple of bilateral trade agreements, such as a double taxation agreement. There's talk of an agreement on recognizing mutual recognition of driver's licenses, which will be helpful to the Israeli diaspora community, which is growing and living in Ireland. And there is many macroeconomic factors that are quite comparable in terms of less so maybe population size, but in terms of high tech, the concentration of services in the economy. Bilateral trade between Ireland and Israel is an exceptionally high at the moment, a historic high in 2022 to the value of $3.2 billion US. And that is very concentrated in the high tech sector, particularly services. We see a lot of potential in cyber, in healthcare, in engineering. And at the moment, in terms of Israel's trade with the EU, Ireland is Israel's 6th most valuable trading partner, which has become quite surprising in the last couple of years. There's also some bilateral investment. The likes of several Israeli companies are invested in Ireland. In 2019, for instance, Wix set up its European support center here. And there's a lot in terms of bilateral investment, Irish companies in Israel in terms of engineering activity. We're going to see in 2023 a further stimulation of this business and tourism activity. I'm very happy to convey to you the fact that El Al are going to operate a direct flight 3 times a week between Dublin and Tel Aviv, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Apparently, there are about 50,000 passengers between Ireland and Israel on an annual basis, direct and indirect. But I think El Al would do immensely well, and they're already seeing high demand for that service. We're hoping, we've facilitated many delegations inward and outward between Ireland and Israel. We're hoping that direct flight will stimulate more in a variety of sectors. We interact with a lot of trade organizations, so regularly with the Israel Export Institute, Federation of Israeli Chambers of Commerce. There's an actual Israel-Ireland chamber based in Tel Aviv, and with Irish agencies such as IDA Ireland, which is an inward investment agency. And I think we're very happy today to have Seema Amir, who is the IDA representative in Israel, joining this webinar today. And again, I'm happy to share her details for any companies that are thinking of potentially opening a branch or activity in Ireland. We also interact with Enterprise Ireland, which is another Irish state agency responsible for promoting the export of goods and services of Irish companies. There's a lot of interaction between startup communities. We see young Israeli startups landing here in Ireland. We see some Irish entrepreneurs getting involved with Israeli startups in Israel, and we hope to be able to help that further. There's a lot of research and development cooperation and activity under the EU Horizon 2020 program. And, you know, in summary, there are many challenges to the Irish-Israel trade relationship. We hope to overcome that with opportunities like this, where we can provide some education and information to Israeli companies that want to do business here. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. I'll just stop sharing my screen here. And I'm very pleased now to just introduce Ofer from the Foreign Trade Administration, who's going to say a couple of words, followed by Ron Pando, and then we move to Ken Waters. Thank you. Thank you,
Colin. Thank you for hosting this very important webinar. So as Colin mentioned, my name is Ofer. I'm based in London, a bit east of Dublin. But we here at the Israel Economic and Trade Mission in London are also working closely with Colin in Dublin. I can share that when it comes to market, as Corrigan mentioned, the EU is Israel's largest market, especially, by the way, for healthcare. Having said that, when it comes to Ireland, it's getting a bit less attention, which is quite surprising given the fact that Ireland is part of the EU, so it follows the EU regulation, and it's an English-speaking country and market. So what we are really keen to do in this webinar is really to open the minds of Israeli companies to the possibilities of the Irish market. And I think that we are very lucky to have Ken and Tony with us here today to share their insights and share what are the strategies that Israeli companies can use in order to explore the Irish markets. So thank you very much, and I hope you have an enjoyable webinar.
Thank you, Ofer. So Ron, if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Ofer. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Ron Pando. I'm the head of biotech and data sectors in the Israel Export Institute. The Israel Export Institute is a non-profit organization whose aim is to help Israeli companies to export their products and technologies all around the world. Together with the trade officers all around the world, we are working together to bring activities, exhibitions, delegations, and today this really wonderful webinar. And wishing you a very productive and successful, interesting webinar. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron. So with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Ken now. And Ken, I think you'll be able to share your screen and we'll enjoy your presentation. You just need to unmute, I think.
Perfect. So does everybody have my full screen, please? Perfect. Morning, everyone. Thanks for the introductions, everyone. As I said, my name is Ken Waters. I'm a Senior Account Director in Hume Brophy, which is a full-service communications agency, which means we specialize in public affairs, i.e. government relations, and public relations as well. We have particular expertise across the company in the likes of agri-food and energy, financial services. And I guess what's most pertinent today is my own area of expertise is around all manner of healthcare within the Irish setting, but also in technology, research and development as well. In terms of healthcare, one of the areas that I've worked a huge amount over the last number of years, because we tend to work where there are issues, and there are issues specifically in the area of medicines access and reimbursement. But equally have done an awful lot of work in various different aspects of the health service. What I'd like to do for you today is to give you a political overview, because the Irish system is very much relationship driven, and policy is set very much at a political level and trickles down based on priority into the health service executive and into our Department of Health, and that's where, as I said, the rubber meets the road in an Irish setting. So you'll forgive me if this seems very top level initially, but I promise it is a value to know this, to understand the context for everything that follows, that both myself and Tony will be talking about. So if we look at the Irish political system, for anybody who's familiar, certainly with the United Kingdom, for example, you'll see a lot of similarities. We have a bicameral two-house system with our Teach Dáil, our TDs. For that, you can read members of Parliament in the lower house. That are elected by what's called PRSTV, proportional representation, single transferable vote. The reason I bring this up is because it gives rise to certain political dynamics, i.e. you can have, multi-seat constituencies, so it's not first past the post. You will also have multiple party members competing for constituencies. So in an Irish setting, you can say that all politics is very, very, very local. And so there's cross-party, but there's also inter-party competition to try and deliver for constituents at a very local level. This plays into our health service because services are very much delivered at a local level when it comes to there's a competition for access to services. Sometimes this is referred to as a postcode lottery. So depending on what part of the country you're residing in, you will have access or degrees of access to different types of services and better services overall. So when we look at the political context, just some things for your own context, I guess, to know that currently we have a three-party coalition. Ireland is traditionally driven by coalition governments, and has been since I think 1989 was the last majority government. This government is currently right in the middle of its term, so a 5-year term with historic Civil War rivals, actually, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who have joined together for the first time in a historic coalition, and the remaining numbers are made up by the Irish Green Party. When you look across the parliamentary benches, you see the rise of another very interesting party called Sinn Féin, who would historically be known as, I guess, centre-left in European terms, who very much push a socialist with a small s agenda, I guess we could describe it as. What we're about to see actually on this Saturday coming up, so very timely that I'm talking to you today, is that we're about to have a cabinet reshuffle. The terms of this agreement within the coalition mean that the leading member of the government, i.e. our Taoiseach, or you can read in various terms, you can read what that is, but the leading member is about to rotate from the Fianna Fáil party to Fine Gael party, which will close out this term of government. And within that, you will have a traditional cabinet reshuffle. When we look at government priorities, I think we can safely say that the two above everything are health and housing, and have been for longer than I've been doing this job. So for a considerable amount of time, our priorities and the stated national priorities are very much health and housing, and they tend to fluctuate and rotate, but it's two very much at the front of mind consistently. Behind that, you know, there's the inflationary pressures which are being felt across a large amount of Europe at the moment. Brexit, specifically in an Irish context, with the nod to the Northern Irish Protocol and what that might mean to UK and Ireland relations, which have improved slightly over recent months, but have been arguably at their lowest ebb for many years over the last 2 or 3 years. And I guess finally as well, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the energy and the related climate crisis that we're currently seeing across Europe as well. So that's just where government is at currently. In terms of who influences health policy, which is also very important to know, because the Irish system is very much relationship driven. So while it might again seem very granular to get into names and details of individuals, it's important to know that these individuals have a large amount of power. We're a relatively small country, and power resides in a very small number of hands, and policy is made by a small number of people. So when we're looking specifically at who influences health policy, we look at our political cabinet, i.e. the leading ministers in the country. We look at our opposition, who are very vocal, who will equally drive the agenda. It's important to know as well that issues are rise and fall on incidents in Ireland as well. So while there is an overriding policy agenda that can easily be overridden by individual events, for instance, last year in May, Ireland issued its first large-scale cyber attack on the health service. So an issue that was previously not high on the agenda immediately became very much on the public and the national agenda in terms of media and in terms of politics. So it's very much issue driven, and that can equally apply to therapy areas as well for anybody who's working in a particular therapy area. That, you know, if there is, you know, a local issue can escalate to a national level very quickly in Ireland, and that can influence health policy. Then our political committees are very influential, specifically in this context. The Committee for Health, the Committee for Jobs, and the Committee for Public Expenditure and Reform, which is an offshoot of the Department of Finance. Then we look at our Department of Health, the HSE, which is the Health Service Executive, which for anybody who's not familiar would be more akin to the NHS style system, albeit I'll come to it briefly. There is a public-private divide in terms of healthcare delivery here. We have a fiscal advisory council that advises government and the senior cabinet members on fiscal policy, which is very influential. And then, as I've mentioned previously, there's a competitive symbiosis between politics, media, local interest groups, i.e. special interests, and patient advocacy groups that can all drive together on a single issue to create momentum behind a certain issue or a certain policy that can escalate it very quickly. So to get into the kind of the meat of what the healthcare system looks like here for anybody who's working in this space, we have a two-tier system, a public and private system. The private system, i.e. private health insurance driven, equates to approximately 48% of the population. The public system, as I said, is delivered by the Health Service Executive. And the lines between these two systems are very blurred, to be perfectly honest, in terms of service delivery and access to services. The health service has historically been under-resourced financially, and while that has been remedied significantly in the last 10 years, to memory, approximately 10 years ago, the health budget was somewhere around 16 to 17 billion, where it's risen to 23.4 for next year and represents about a quarter of all government budget spending. In terms of our population, we very much have an aging population suffering from increased incidence of chronic illness. So demand is rising across the board in all areas, and this is putting the system under immense pressures. So despite the increased spending, the spending is arguably only keeping up with the run rate for demand. Within that, the delivery of health services in Ireland is overly reliant very much on what we call the acute setting or the hospital setting. And there's big strides being made to try and push service delivery away from this primary or acute setting and move it more into the community. So more services are delivered at a very local level in local settings, such as community health organizations or similarly through private general practitioners. If I leave you with anything from this webinar, what I'd impress on you, that the biggest problem, and I can say this categorically within the Irish Health Service currently, is on the recruitment and retention crisis. We have a huge brain drain of all manner of healthcare professionals outside the country. So we would see in particular across the likes of consultants, of nursing practitioners who are essentially taking their skills and relocating to places like New Zealand, like Australia, to a slightly lesser degree, North America. The HSE actually has to employ something like 6,000 new staff annually just to keep pace with the level of turnover within staff. And it's a huge issue for them that they're trying to tackle currently. So how does that context then meet with government priorities? I think relatively self-explanatory to say that service level capacity is an issue. So this recruitment and retention crisis has a knock-on effect on our waiting lists, which are the highest they've ever been. I think there's currently approximately 10,000 people on waiting lists, and that applies to elective issues, but it also applies to our emergency departments as well. Staffing and recruitment is obviously very high on the agenda to tackle these problems. Our COVID recovery is still very much underway to try and bring back up some service levels up to where they were pre-2020. Cost containment is certainly a priority amongst governments. They see that aging population and the increased demand obviously driving increased spend. And there's a very clear acknowledgement within the Department of Health and the HSE that they need to try and get their budgets underrun. It is not uncommon for the health service executive to overrun their budget by Q3 of any annual fiscal year. So there's a huge push on to try and get better control of their cost containment. And within that, they're looking at something called multi-annual budgeting. So i.e. looking to create budgets which will run for 2 or 3 years for services, as opposed to an annual, more reactive state. Most recently, last week, I think it was last Thursday, finally they agreed a contract for consultants. So this will be the first time that there has been a public sector consultant contract, which is very important, as it will hopefully pave the way for more consultants coming home and better retention of consultants, albeit there are some issues to be phased out. Ireland historically, as I've said, has a very politically driven healthcare system. So in an attempt to try and take some of the politics out of healthcare delivery, in 2016, they created an all-party political committee with the intention to try and develop a plan, an agreed cross-party plan to try and reform the health system. This is known as Sláinte Care. So Sláinte Care being an Irish term for, Sláinte in Irish means health, i.e. the healthcare plan, which was a 10-year cross-party reform plan that was going to cost approximately 65 million a year, with 2 express intentions. One is to move the nodal point of care away from that acute setting into the primary, and secondly, to try and create better pathways for patients to access services. So essentially moving to what they anticipated or hoped would be a fully public system, albeit there was acknowledgement that this would be hugely difficult for some of the lines in the sand for anyone who's delivering care in a private setting. That plan, unsurprisingly, possibly, has had some huge difficulties. It's led to some very high-profile resignations, including the Director General of that programme and the Chief Executive, both of which have resigned. Our Director General of the Health Service Executive has also resigned in the last 6 months. So essentially there is a plan in place. However, progress is incredibly slow, and I would expect that it will take longer than that 10 years to actually implement, if in fact we ever get to that point. Obviously, we've talked very specifically around the healthcare system, but to look specifically at the digital health priorities, which I know is of interest to this group. So I think there is a growing acknowledgement that e-health is something that Ireland effectively has to get their head around and has to make big strides to try and improve. It's recognised as a key enabler of the health service reform, which is again acknowledged through Sláintecare, and investment has to be prioritised into initiatives which would deliver a lot of that Sláintecare reform that I'm referring to. Albeit, I would argue that the budget that's being put behind this programme doesn't match with the stated priority. It's 130 million currently for ICT infrastructure in a budget of 23.4 billion. Albeit, I will say this, the HSE publishes what it's called its service plan for the following year. We should expect that in the next week to 10 days, which will show the updated budget for next year. So it'll be interesting to see for the 2023 service plan if there has been an increase in funding allocated for foundational and cyber infrastructure, for existing national programs, and for HSE transformational priorities. What you would hear from anyone involved in trying to reform the HSE, that it's akin to trying to change the tires on a moving car. So effectively what they're looking at doing is trying to create a balance between that transformative technologies while obviously maintaining service delivery, but also doing some very basic remediation programs, such as, you know, trying to increase basic things such as moving more of the HSE's computer systems away from antiquated programs. For instance, the HSE service or the HSE breach, which happened last year, was largely down to the fact that some staff were still using the likes of Windows 95 for certain programs. So effectively, you know, there was a very, very open and easy soft target. So there's a recognition across government that we need to bulk up and make the systems less vulnerable effectively. So some of those transformational e-health things that we're talking about, they're really looking at solutions that will enable the two major problems, which is service care delivery and recruitment and retention. There's an acknowledgement if they can make better ways of working, they can drive efficiencies in the likes of waiting lists, discharging patients, patient referrals, healthcare pathways, e-health, sorry, I've lost the phrase, but effectively anything that drives efficiencies in the patient pathway is of massive importance to them. Equally, we're in the development of our first National Children's Hospital. It's a new hospital. There is a significant budget there and acknowledgement that they want to make it a digital first hospital, albeit I know for a fact that a number of ICT providers have stepped away from that procurement program because they don't believe that the budget matches effectively what the ask is. So I think there's a little bit of education and awareness that needs to be delivered to senior civil servants in different areas to show where and what's actually needed so that expectation meets reality. And then I've just listed some more of the health priorities that the HSE and the Department of Health have identified as projects that they really want to try and progress over the following year. So if we look at the service plan currently, these are the types of priorities that the HSE itself are noting as being high list issues. So they really want to stabilize the operational environment and deliver foundational infrastructure and cyber tech resilience. As I said, the HSE breach last year was a major watershed moment in terms of acknowledging what needs to be done, the under-resourcing of the likes of our National Cybersecurity Centre, and putting proper resources behind it in terms of manpower, but equally budget as well. So I think big steps have been made in the 12 to 15 months since that breach, albeit there is a lot more work to be done. And I think they would be very interested in hearing from potential partners of best in practice on how that can be done in an efficient and a cost-effective way. So that leads into the second point that I have there, which is to deploy a corporate-led cybersecurity education and communication program. So there is an acknowledgement as well that, you know, the first line of defense is effectively HSE staff, Department of Health staff, who are going to be the front users of all these programs, and making sure people are cyber aware and security compliance within the HSE will be a priority within that. Then if we look at, they really want to look at advancing the secure integration of applications and information environments, because as I said, they very much see this as enabling those transformation programs that I've referenced just previously. And then the acknowledgement as well within the HSE that they really need to deliver these core national programs in order to try and drive the efficiencies that they've outlined within that Sláinte Care, that 10-year reform plan over the coming years. So for instance, if we look at the type of things within that Sláinte Care program that they've called out, they're looking at waiting list systems, health performance visualization platforms, e-discharging and e-referral programs, as well as e-prescriptions as well for the first time. So they're also looking as well as what we can do to try and encourage our pandemic response to make sure that the system is appropriate and suitable for any future challenges that may arise. And then finally, I guess one of the major ones, which I think Tony's actually referenced previously in our own chats, is around electronic healthcare records. The Irish system is very, very reliant still on paper systems. So even that alone would be a huge administrative burden lifted if we could get to a solid and consistent electronic healthcare record platform, which would be of huge interest to the country, I think, overall. So I think that's everything that I'd outlined, but I know we'll have time for questions at the end, and very much looking forward to answering any of those shortly.
It's great. Thanks so much, Ken. I think that was a really good overview. I know things don't exist in a vacuum, and it was great to get sort of the overview of the political environment in which healthcare has to exist. I'm sure it's similar in Israel. I wanted to mention as well, we'll have Q&As are available. If anybody wants to submit questions, by all means, please do during the course of the presentations, and we will take those questions at the end. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Tony.
Actually, sorry, Colin, just before you finish, I knew I had one other note that I intend on referencing as well. The one thing I failed to mention as well, which I know is of interest to the group as well, is that Ireland's currently very much open for business and looking to try and encourage the greater increase of clinical trials and high-level clinical trials across the country. And there's two bodies in particular who are driving that agenda, one being Clinical Trials Ireland, which is a semi-state body, and then secondly, the Health Research Board, which is a fully state body. So both of those are very much looking at trying to encourage greater use of clinical trials here. Historically, the infrastructure hasn't been up to scratch. So if you're looking for a high-tech medicine or the likes of ATMPs, advanced therapies, gene therapies, they would have historically had to maybe been trialed in the UK, elsewhere, and then delivered here, where there's a big push, especially due to the fact that Ireland is home to 10 of the 11 largest pharma companies in the world, that those companies see a great symbiosis in having a presence here, but also being able to do high-level clinical trials in Ireland. So that is a major focus, I will say that. And I know our colleague from the IDA would also probably agree with me when I say that.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Ken. I think it touched on a very interesting point. That could be probably a webinar in itself almost, but it just goes to show, when you pull the thread, you explore these issues, there are lots of opportunities there. So with that, I'm now, sorry for the delay, Tony, very, very pleased to introduce Tony. And I think companies will really get something out of this in terms of, the very specific, the objective is to try and get your solutions into clients in Ireland. And I think Tony's presentation will really go a long way to helping you with that. So over to you, Tony.
Great, thanks very much. So hopefully everybody can see my screen and hear me okay? Okay, so just very briefly, Orbital is an organization that helps companies to win government contracts, and we do that with a technology platform, and we do that through analyzing the procurement landscape. So when we talk about the Irish healthcare system, there's two buyers that it's really important to consider. One is the HSE itself that Ken mentioned extensively, and the other is the Office of Government Procurement, and they split procurement, what they buy between them. So the HSE leads on things like health sector specific categories. So that's all the things you'll be interested in, like medical professional services, products, diagnostic equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and so forth. They're also focused on categories of digital health and innovation. The Office of Government Procurement buys everything else. So professional services, IT, legal services, recruitment, and so forth. And of course, there's opportunities in those areas as well, because the HSE needs those types of services to be effective as well. One outlier to note is that the HSE also employs a strategic sourcing rapid response team, which was used extensively during the pandemic. And again, one of the things that Ken alluded to, the Irish health system is, it's at least, a car that you're driving and trying to change the wheels, but very often the rules are applied in a somewhat loose fashion. And this sourcing rapid response team has been accused of maybe going outside of its remit and accelerating procurement processes without the need for an urgent need like the pandemic introduced. On the right-hand side, you just see there is a HSE corporate procurement plan. It's worth having a read of that just to get an understanding of what the HSE intends to focus on in the next period. So that's quite useful, and there's a link to it right there. Okay, so if I just move on to the next page. The HSE spends about 3.7 billion euro through the public procurement process. You can see on the right-hand side the list of things that it buys and where those categories of spend, the volume and the value of those contracts. There are about 15,000 suppliers into the HSE at the moment. And just some statistics worth pointing out. 55% of suppliers into the HSE receive less than 5,000 euro per annum. So when you look at the 15,000, there's really only 7,500 or so that are actually generating significant income from the HSE. And the top 400 of those 7,000 or so, they account for 80% of spend. And the top 10 account for 25% of spend. So there's a real concentration at the top of what it is that the HSE spends its money on. But having said that, and it's important to note, the HSE is no stranger to innovation and taking on smaller companies, innovative companies, international companies, where there is a value to be delivered into the health service. There are 430 points of use, that's local community centres, it's hospitals and so forth. There's 4.7 thousand stock items and 12,000 cost centres, which is something of a nightmare. But that just gives you a little bit of an idea of the scale of what it is that the government buys. And one of the things that is worth noting is that of that 3.7 billion, not all of it is transparently spent. And that can be an advantage and a disadvantage, but about half of what the HSE spends is done in a less transparent way, but it's done through, and again, Ken mentioned relationships and prior knowledge of what it is that the HSE is trying to buy and prior influencing of what the HSE should buy. And certainly in the space of innovation where the HSE often doesn't know what it needs to spend its money on, it can be quite valuable to build those relationships early on to establish the buying opportunities for yourself further down the line. There are about 400 HSE competitions with a value of over 25,000 euro per annum. So 25,000 euro is the threshold above which contracts need to be publicly advertised. So as you noted in one of the previous slides, about half of what the government spends is below the 25,000 threshold. The other 400 competitions, they split into two different categories. There's the Office of Government Procurement, the etenders.gov.ie website, and there's about 150 low value, and that's between 25,000 and 139,000 opportunities that are published there each year. And then there's TED.europa.eu, which is the pan-European platform. And there's about 250 high-value opportunities. That's above 139,000 euro and up to multiple of millions. And they're published there. And then there's obviously thousands that are either below the 25,000 euro or outside of scope. And outside the scope can mean that it's a multi-year contract and or that it's a restricted competition or so forth. So there's about 400 competitions, a lot of opportunities, And one of the ways that you can get innovative products into the HSE is by identifying sponsors in the HSE who are willing to put a competition in place specifically for you. And there are ways that you can do that. I'll happily talk about them later on, how you can bring innovation into the health system, how you can run pilots outside of these processes and get your products into a healthcare setting. So in terms of market access, the HSE and tender competitions in general in Ireland, they're open to any company or country in accordance with the terms of all UN, OSCE and EU embargoes or restrictions. And there are 4 principles under which all procurement in Ireland happens. The first is transparency, and notwithstanding what I just said about some of the limited transparency within the HSE, about half of what they spend, about €2 billion, is done in a very transparent manner, and it's done through those 2 platforms, eTenders and TED.europa.eu that I mentioned. They also run competitions under the principle of non-discrimination and equal treatment. And that basically means that regardless of what country you come from or any of your ethic or backgrounds, all participants in a competition are treated equally. And I would say from my experience in evaluating competitions and selecting suppliers for particular services, that is very much the case. Everybody does get equal treatment. And it is certainly true that in 99 out of 100 cases, the best company wins. Proportionality is another thing, and this is important. Proportionality means that the barriers to participate in a competition should be consummate with the value of the competition. And one of the important ones that often catches companies out is the turnover or the track record. So if, for example, the contract is €1 million contract, that means that a proportional turnover should be €2 million. So it's equitable with the value of the contract. And that goes for things like track record as well. So one of the things that you will always get evaluated on when you're competing for a public contract is whether you have the requisite skills, experience, and expertise from previous work. And again, that has to be proportional as well. So often proportionality in that case speaks to the size of the contracts, the value of the contracts, and the particular goods or products provided or the particular services provided, and how complex they were. And then the last one is mutual recognition, and that means that anyone from any country is treated the same, so long whatever the relationship that Ireland has with Israel, for example, and Israel has with Ireland, that follows through into the procurement process. And all of those can be seen in much greater detail as Directive 2014 of the European Parliament. And if you ever do have an issue with a competition in Ireland, that's where you will go back to determine what your rights are and to make sure that you are being fairly treated under the system. And working with local suppliers, one of the ways of getting into the public system, especially when you don't have those relationships, is to try and identify local suppliers who already have contracts with the HSE. So as mentioned earlier, there's 15,000 suppliers to the HSE, but there's no consolidated list of whom those suppliers are. About 7,500 of them are known to, certainly known to Orbital, but known to systems that collate e-tender award information, because when you win a competition, your name is published. Now, 40% of HSE contracts above €25,000 have a corresponding award notice. So in the Orbital platform I mentioned earlier, the platform that my company sells, we have a list of the companies that have won HSE contracts above €25,000 and the contacts in those companies. And I'll be happy to share some of that list with you, but it's a really good way of establishing a relationship with the HSE is to leverage the relationship that somebody else has. One thing that is important is having a demonstrable evidence of working together. So when you are choosing suppliers or local partners to work with, it will be important that it doesn't appear to be a marriage of convenience, that there is some value that's being brought to the table by both sides. And of course, one of the things that local suppliers can bring is presence. So if you need to be physically present at a HSE site, or you need to be particularly responsive to an issue, then the local supplier can absolutely do that. And that is the way that I would recommend primarily to get into the HSE. So even though you can compete for the contracts, and you'll see those contracts on eTenders or TED.Europa, it is a really good idea to look for companies who have won similar contracts or complementary contracts, and use those as your the thin end of the wedge to get into the HSE. So there's just an example. That's what an award notice looks like. You can see that's the name of the company who won the contract. There's the name of the contract into the HSE. You'll also notice as well, just one thing I'll point out, the number of tenders received is just one in this particular case. It's an interesting thing to note that of all the contracts the HSE publishes, about 25% of them only get a single bidder, and about 10% of them don't get any bidder at all. And this is down to the complexity that companies often see with the procurement process. And the process isn't actually that complex. Certainly, if you've done it a few times, it becomes quite repetitive actually, and quite straightforward to compete for contracts. But it's indicative that it's not as competitive to compete for and to win contracts in an Irish setting, particularly if you have innovative products and solutions, and particularly if you can point to case studies in Israel or elsewhere that demonstrate the efficacy of the products and solutions that you intend to offer. So let me just stop with that there, and I can hand back to you if there's no questions.
Tony, that's really excellent. And I think probably, in my opinion, you've probably already answered many of the questions that companies would be asking. So thank you for that very comprehensive overview. There are a couple of questions I'd like to put in on behalf of some of the participants today. So one is, maybe could the panelists elaborate on the issue of women's health? So for instance, GP versus gynecological patient journey. Does women's health gain any traction at all in Ireland? So maybe if we start with that one, and then we'll get to the next couple of questions. We give about 2 or 3 minutes to this, if that's okay. Ken, you're nodding your head. Do you want to take that initially? Are you happy to?
I'll spare Tony's blushes and I'll take this one. Yeah, absolutely. I think women's health has become a major issue across the country. You know, there is a recognition, and to my previous point about incidents driving agendas, I think this is a clear example. There was 2 previous national scandals which hugely, unfortunately and regrettably, led to some fatalities in Ireland due to some system errors, and in some points arguably negligence. So yes, I think women's health has massively become a high agenda issue, and that's reflected in the fact that our political caucus has now, it's approaching, it's not equality, but it's certainly, there's much better female representative within our political system and within the leadership of the HSE. So while by no means perfect, I think great strides have been made, albeit with a lot more to be done in areas such as cervical check and reporting, breast check. For the first time ever, Ireland's looking at introducing funding to assist on the likes of reproductive health. So for the likes of artificial insemination or other sort of supports. So those issues are being actively looked at, and in a lot of cases, 1, policy is changing, and 2, it's actually at quite an advanced stage in some instances as well.
Excellent. Thanks. I think you've addressed that very well, Ken. So another question coming in from Ronnie. Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for the highly useful information. Can you talk about the 48% of the private sector? So presumably, you know, we focus very much on the HSE contracts, Tony, I know, in terms of the tendering process. So does the private healthcare work much in the same way? I think that might be the question.
This is possibly the hardest part of our health service to explain. Yes, in simple matter, yes. What you buy when you buy private health insurance in Ireland, which as a reference is approximately 48% of the adult population, that it gives you preferred access. There are exclusively private hospitals, there are semi-private hospitals, and then there are public hospitals. What you'll see within public and semi-private hospitals, you will have public sector employees who see both private patients and public patients at the same time, which is why I made that reference to the public sector consultants contract, to try and produce explicitly public sector consultants where their primary focus is on delivering healthcare to public sector. Sorry, I appreciate the questions about the private, but you kind of have to deal with both to assess both sides. Health insurance in Ireland is, by American standards, certainly respectable in terms of cost, albeit the cost is prohibitive for a significant amount of the population. So I think when you buy private healthcare insurance, what you're really buying is preferred access to comparable systems in a lot of cases, albeit depending on your level of coverage, you can get, you know, guaranteed nearly immediate access through the private system. But as I've referenced again, sorry already, waiting lists are a huge issue as well. So this is where the system becomes an issue, and which is why the system becomes political, because at times you can have, private patients with a less immediate need getting access to healthcare that arguably, if you're a healthcare professional looking at two comparable charts, you would say that, you know, the private patient has a greater need, but the public patient has the greater need, but the private one has health insurance, so will arguably get treatment faster. I hope that makes sense. If not, feel free to drop me a message and I can try and answer anything specific around that dynamic better in a more concise way.
That's excellent, Ken. Thanks. And it's actually, Ronnie, as a follow-on question, which is probably targeted to me. And the question is, would it be possible to get a list of medical device distributors for HSE and private sector? So that's already a couple of days' work for me, Ronnie. And you can contact me directly. My experience is healthcare distributors in Ireland, you know, they serve both markets. We know some of the large ones. We know some of the smaller, more bespoke ones. So yes, certainly reach out to me after the webinar and I'll be happy to help you with that. So we've one other question. I think Ken touched on this during his presentation, the synergy between public and private health. I think we touched on some of that. And then the top priority, what is the top priority in the Irish healthcare system? And again, we can look at this, I suppose, from two points. I know, Ken, you spoke about, you know, service delivery and recruitment, but I suppose in clinical, I take this question in the clinical sense, is there priority in terms of clinical care? So for instance, in the UK, oncology would be one of the top areas of interest. So do you see, and Tony, maybe through tendering processes, do you see areas of clinical care that are coming to the fore?
No, I don't. There's nothing in particular coming to the fore. Like, I guess innovation in the health system in Ireland is moves at a snail's pace. In the lead up to this, I noted that I'd spent some time around 2008, between 2008 and 2014 in Israel, working with Maccabi on mobile point of care solutions. Those mobile point of care solutions are only now being rolled out in Ireland, and not by the HSE, but by private suppliers like webdoctor.ie, who provide some sort of diagnosis. But even that isn't connected or particularly well connected with the health system. I just recently had to get an MRI, which I couldn't get through my GP because they couldn't see me because of the COVID restrictions. So I did get it on Web Doctor, where the barrier to getting a treatment was much lower, but then I had to go back into the health system. So it becomes, and as Ken mentioned, access isn't the same for everybody. So it's all incredibly disjointed. If there was any sort of grand plan, and you will see the procurement priorities set out in that 2022-24 document I mentioned earlier, but there's just so much to be done. It is, you can take any of the innovations that have been developed in Israel over the last 12 years, and I can assure you that none of them are present in the Irish setting yet. So it's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, Excellent. Ken, I see you nodding your head intently there, like you have a lot to tell us on this point.
So I think it's a really good point about where priorities lie. And I think this, again, possibly feeds back to what I was talking about around priority issues. So for instance, there are areas where patient outcomes have actually like really improved in the last decade or so. For instance, Ireland developed a national cancer strategy approximately 10 years ago. And we will actually see in specific disease areas such as oncology, like you're mentioning in the UK, we've actually made huge strides, and we'd have some of the best patient outcomes on oncology across Europe. Where there's other areas where, you know, we're massively lagging behind. And I've seen this across a range of different areas. I think COPD is one of those areas what I think is going to be a big emphasis over the coming years, or it certainly needs to be. There's an acknowledgement across government through something called the Healthy Ireland Strategy that they're really looking at disease prevention and diagnosis as a first point. So what they're really trying to do is tackle some of the major issues from the outset, as opposed to before they get to requiring care and support. But I think in terms of disease management, if I had to pick one, I'd say COPD is probably the one that is probably going to require the most kind of work over the next while. And I've worked at various times with different clients in Ireland on trying to progress that and trying to address national strategies. So I think when there's a plan in place, they tend to be delivered very well, and they do have very clear outcomes and outputs. But I think this is why I've been so keen to stress the political side of things, because when there is a plan, it gets delivered. It's when it's not on the political agenda, or where it's not driven by politics, directed to the Department of Health, directed to the HSE to deliver, that is where things lag behind.
That's excellent. Thanks for that. I know we have a couple more questions coming in, which is great. It's great to see. And the objective of this session was to really stimulate this discussion and give the companies an appetite and a willingness to sort of examine Ireland as a place where they can do business. So a couple of questions, one from Noam Alan, what is the level of digitization? And I guess the answer, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, it varies according to public and private sector. I think some of the private hospitals that I'm aware of have very high level of digitization. There's a body called eHealth Ireland, which I think is leading the charge on digitizing the health service executive, the HSE, in the public sector. I don't know if you have anything to add, Ken or Tony, on that, or, you know, certainly it's something I can get into separately with Noam to assess. Another question is, which body in Ireland is charged with infusing innovation? Is it the HSE or is it the hospitals themselves? I think you're probably better placed to answer that. Probably a mix, I would suggest. Ken, maybe would you take that one?
Sure. I guess just to answer both quickly. Yeah, completely accurate, Colin. I think, again, we come back to that kind of postcode lottery, and yes, the private sector being more advanced. But what you'll see is where there have been pilot projects launched, for instance, our maternity hospital in Cork was pulled kicking and screaming into developing a full e-health solution in the company, which was initially absolutely pushed back. But then when it was delivered within the space of a matter of weeks, they realized that it was hugely successful and was driving efficiencies across the board. So I think you'll see pockets of really high level of digitization, but then you'll see big gulfing chasms where, you know, we're still very much on paper records. In terms of R&D, there's a couple of bodies, and I think that's part of arguably the problem, that there isn't a singular body looking to try and drive it. So you'd have the likes of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Innovation, Enterprise, Trade and Employment, which is very much pushing an R&D agenda from a jobs perspective. There is what's known as a knowledge development box, which is a low rate of tax specifically for any IP delivered that's created in Ireland. So they are trying to do it. We have a government CIO, who's a guy called Barry Lowry, who's equally involved in a kind of an overarching all of government strategy for digitization. And then, as Tony mentioned also, there's the Office of Government Procurement, which would very much have that role within their parent department, which is the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So I think exactly to your point, that there are a number of people trying to do it, but I would say there's arguably not one singular vision for how to go about doing it. Albeit if there was one, I'd say the one that's most likely to do it is public expenditure and reform.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ken. So the questions are coming in thick and fast, and probably we're approaching the end of our webinar, but I would encourage those companies who are on the call, to reach out to me. I'm happy to facilitate contact with Ken and Tony. I'll take the very last one, and I think it's important that maybe on the minds of a few attendees here. Is it correct to approach work with a single partner for both the UK and Irish markets, or is it best to tackle each separately? So from my perspective, Offer, you can come in on this as well if you would. Ireland and the UK are both very different markets. I mean, clinical care might have, a lot of comparables, but UK no longer being within the European Union obviously is the key difference there. But they're very different culturally, I think, and they're very different in terms of resources and spend. Offer, have you anything to add on that, maybe?
No, I think that we had a really interesting discussion. We could have prolonged this webinar for 2 hours and still have questions and more information to be shared. But I'm certain that we left food for thought, and even I learned about a new gateway to identify relevant partners in Ireland. So thank you, Tony, for sharing this information, and also for you, Ken, for sharing the structure and providing all the information we need at first to understand how everything works in the Irish healthcare market. I'd just like to end and say thank you to the Export Institute for doing this event with us, and also for you, Colin, for initiating and managing this event. I'm sure that now we will have a bit more requests from Israeli companies to explore partners in the Irish market, and we are ready for it.
I've no doubt, and just be gentle with those inquiries, please, to all the attendees. So Tony actually touched on a point which I'd be delighted to follow up. You talked very briefly about pilot projects and ways of bringing innovative companies to the attention of the HSE and others. And I think that's something that, if that is part of the outcome, potentially, that we try to do that with some of the attendees today, I think that would be exceptional. So with that, without running over time too much, I want to thank you all again, to Ken from Hume Brophy, to Tony from Orbital Group, to Offer, and to Ron Pando from the Export Institute. It's been an excellent session, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up. And if you want to reach out to Ken or Tony, please let me know, or you can do so directly. They had their emails on the presentation. And thank you very much for joining. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.